when using React, there is a handful of principles that you should keep in mind when choosing your state structure for your different state in React. And today we're going to go over 5 different principles for choosing the structure of your state in React. Now, if you want to learn more about this and see more examples, you can come right here in the docs, and React kind of goes over these principles as well. And I'm, of course, using the docs as kind of my source of truth to share this with you guys. So coming back here, number 1 is going to be grouping related state. So what I mean by that is that if you always kind of update 2 state variables at the same time, it might be a good idea to merge those into a single state variable. And the reason for this, or one of the reasons for this, is because it helps prevent your state kind of getting out of sync. So for example, in your application here, let's say that you have a user profile or maybe a patient profile or something like that, and a user can come into your application and they can change this profile. So they can change their first name, their last name, their email, but they're always going to be doing these changes at one time. You're always going to be making changes to kind of the entire profile, or you're not going to be making changes at all. Well, since this state is kind of representing just a user profile, rather than just like individual pieces of state, it's probably a good idea to, instead of having separate state variables like first name, last name, and email, merging that into just one state variable called profile, and having first name, last name, email properties of that profile object. And then the way that you would update that can be seen right here, to where basically we use the name and value of the event target, assuming these would be inputs, and then we would make sure to spread the previous profile into the new profile. So making sure that we don't lose any state variables here or any properties of this initial object. So making sure to do that merge, and then using JavaScript dynamic properties to set the new value of whatever name is being changed here. So merging a related state into one, especially if you always change those state variables at the same time, this can be a really helpful strategy. So grouping related state. Number 2 is going to be avoiding contradictions in state. So you basically want to avoid having state that can disagree with each other, as this can just kind of lead to bugs and errors. So for example, below you could get into a state where is loading is true and is loading is also true, which kind of contradicts each other, because if it's loaded, then it can't really still be loading. So here we see that if we set up these pieces of state here, which is very common to see, I've probably made this mistake, and I know I've seen it before of other developers making this mistake. And I use the term mistake loosely, like this can work, it can be a non-issue, but you can get into, like I said, a contradictory state here, to where we could have a case to where is loading is still true and is loaded is true, because maybe you just forget to set is loading back to false. And that can lead to just kind of weird issues in your state. But if instead of doing something like this, if you decide to just use a single state status, that kind of removes this potential mistake altogether, to where you could have a status of is loading or a status of is loaded. And that kind of prevents the possibility of having these contradictory states. And I realize that I just have a single quoted here, but it of course was meant to be just a empty string here as the kind of default status. But this is just one example of how you can avoid contradictory states or potential states that can disagree with each other and cause issues in your application down the road. So when possible, try to avoid these contradictory or states that could disagree with each other. Number 3, and I talked about this a little bit in my previous video, but try to avoid redundant state. So if you can calculate or derive some information based on your existing state or even the component's props, then you don't really need any extra state for that information. So for example, you might see in certain applications something like this, to where you might have a list of items, but you might also have a separate piece of state for the number of items in that list, which again, this can work, but it's not really needed. Like if you can avoid redundant state and just kind of get away with using less state in React, it's probably going to make things a little bit more straightforward in your application, because anytime you're using state, you're using some more dynamic data, which can be a little bit tricky to manage over time if you have a ton of different slices of state. Ask me how I know. So in this case, we don't really need this item count piece of state because it's really just the items.length. So instead of having this entire piece of state, we could just have a JavaScript variable const item count is equal to the items.length. So we would get rid of this piece of state right here because it's kind of redundant. We can derive the item count just based on this piece of state right here. So if you can calculate some information based on existing state, or if a component has props passed in, no need to make extra state for it. When you can, don't create extra state if it's not needed. Number 4, avoid duplication in state. So this might sound similar to number 3, but is just slightly different here. So when the same data is duplicated between multiple state variables or within nested objects, it's difficult to kind of keep them in sync once again. So reduce duplication when you can. Say we have an items array again, and then we also want to know like what's the current item, or maybe a better name for this would have been like what's the selected item if a user is viewing just a single item. Well, one way to do this would be we have our items array to where say we have an item name as well as a ID for this item. And this should actually probably be title property is apple and then title property is banana. But I think you kind of get what I mean. So it has the name of the item as well as an ID for each item here. And then originally we have the current item. Well, that's just set to an object that has the name of the item here as well as the ID of the item. But you can see we're duplicating state here. Our items list has this item, and our current item is just like a duplication of an item within our items list. So a potentially better way to do this is instead of making the current item be the entire item object itself, just set the current item to be the ID of an item in the list. And this prevents you from duplicating the item itself, and you're just using the item ID to represent the current item. So this prevents any issues of things kind of falling out of sync, and it reduces duplication in your app, which can be helpful especially in more kind of complex applications. And then number 5 here, and this one I feel like is more of an obvious one. It's more so just like a general good practice when you're coding overall to not try to work with deeply nested data. But in React, try to avoid deeply nested state when you can, and prefer structure that has your state in more of a flat data structure. So before is going to be maybe you have some task data to where you have a task property and a meta property with a details property and then properties within those. And like this state is just going to be tricky to manage because it's going to be dynamic and changing over time, and really trying to like update this state. Well, you have to make sure that you are creating copies of all this nested data, and it can be really, really hard. So a better approach here would be to just flatten this data out. Instead of having this deeply nested title and description and due date and status, just create an object that has a flat structure of data here. So this object just has a title, description, due date, and status property, all on the same level, compared to having this deeply nested structure, which makes it much easier to update here to where we just spread the previous tasks in and then update the new task, rather than needing to create copies of all of our deeply nested objects and making this much more difficult to work with. So in React, 5 principles of kind of choosing your state structure is trying to group related state. So if you always update 2 or more variables at the same time, consider grouping those into the same state variable. Avoid state that can potentially disagree with each other or contradicts each other, like an is loading and an is loading piece of state. Maybe just use a status state instead. Avoid redundant state. So if you can calculate or derive information based on a component's existing state or props, then no need to create extra state for that. And then avoid duplication in state. So instead of having 2 state slices that contain kind of the same values within them, maybe just use an ID for one to represent a selected item, and then generally try to avoid deeply nested state and flatten that state out to make things a little bit more maintainable and easier to work with. So hopefully this video kind of helps you out when deciding on the structure of your state. I know this would have definitely helped me out when I was kind of first starting out and maybe newer to React, and honestly, this was a good refresher to kind of go over for me as well. So yeah, hope this helps out, and I'll see you in that next one.